Last but not least, on the presentation side, we will hear from Dr. Kyshun Webster. Dr. Webster is the CEO for Operation REACH. He has served as an expert in advising legislators at the state and national level on parent involvement, and will talk to us tonight about parent involvement sort of in a national context and connected to federal policy. Dr. Webster.
Well, first of all, I just want to do a shameless plug for my book that came out. It's called Parents Left Behind. It came out in June. And what's unique about this book is that it is a top-down study that explains nationally what some of the complications have been at the federal level that trickle down to state-level implementation that affected how parental involvement programs look locally in our schools. And I use New Orleans Public Schools, the state of Louisiana, and D.C., the U.S. Department of Education, as units of analysis for this study. The study was actually conducted about 5 years ago, just before Katrina, and some of it's been updated in a book, and the relevance is still important because, as we know, this year we are beginning to look at the reauthorization of the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and there have been a lot of lessons learned about what's worked and what hasn't worked in No Child Left Behind, and particularly as it relates to parental involvement. There are a few national groups that have formed who are saying, hey, we have to get it right. We talk about parental involvement all the time. Parental involvement, is it really pie in the sky? But the question that I raise is, will we ever get around to it? And it's important to raise that question because some of my work has found, you talk to school administrators, they say, my school will be better if parents were more involved. You talk to teachers and they say children are failing because parents are not as involved. We don't see the parental involvement we saw 10, 20 years ago. And there's some reasons why we see some of the challenges with that. But first of all, why is this work important? And I think Lucy highlighted some of the importance. We have more than 40 years of research that shows positive correlations between high parental involvement and student achievement. It's not, we can't argue with it. And when we associate good schools with, quote, bad schools, one of the number one factors is high parental involvement with, quote, the good schools. So parental involvement is more than a notion. It really has an effect on student achievement. As more options evolve in this new market of public education, particularly here in New Orleans, school choice, it's important for new school leaders to understand parents are making decisions and that there's the parent-consumer phenomenon, and you want to get your parental involvement right because parents have the right to walk and make other options and decisions. So why not focus on it, particularly here in New Orleans, because we know enrollment is correlated with the ability to open schools, sustain schools, etc. And then number three is it's mandated. It's a federal law. We have to comply. But interestingly, one of the number one findings from most of your federal monitoring Title I programs is parental involvement. Schools nationally are not complying with those mandates. All right? But did we just create these laws for parental involvement? Absolutely not. They go back to the 1950s. And in the 1960s, and in 1980, and in 1990. So it was all reiteration saying you gotta involve parents, you gotta involve parents, you gotta involve parents, folks. But we still have not seen that. All right, what's the current reality of parental involvement in schools? Number one, it's underfunded. There's 1% of Title I funds that are mandated for parental involvement. So in the average school, that might be a budget of $4,000 to $5,000 for the year. All right? And that's not counting the parent liaison salary. In progressive school districts, they may spend 5% of that. But 4% of it is taken up by paying parent liaisons and administrative staff who represent symbolically the notion of engaging and involving parents. It's not prioritized. There's not staff time allocated to it. And for those of us who run nonprofits, we know the importance of staff allocations. So if you don't have staff working on it, it doesn't get done. All right? Widespread ignorance of the law is what my study found, that teachers didn't know about it, parents didn't know about it, school administrators didn't know about it, and even state implementers didn't know about it. And part of the reason is because after the law was enacted, it took 4 years for the Department of Ed under the former administration to write policy guidance saying this is how it gets implemented. This is what you really have to do. So they didn't have policy guidance on how to implement the new requirements for parental involvement under No Child Left Behind. Strategic planning for PI programs are rare and non-existent. We sit around and we plan for student achievement, but the conversation of parental involvement is hardly ever equated with that. So we don't do strategic planning around how do we get parents involved in meaningful ways and really include that in strategic planning opportunities. Program conceptualization is from a school-centric perspective. So very often how these programs get developed, the teachers and the principals say, you know, what parents really need, and then they say, we'll build it and we hope they come. So if we want true parent engagement, we have to what? Have conversations with parents and see what matters to them. So design of programs can't be school-centric and have to bring parents into the conversation at the point of conceptualization. No internal infrastructure for effective implementation. That goes back to staff, money, resources. Initiatives are fragmented and episodic in nature. So what some schools call parental involvement is the open house that they have once a year. And sometimes they ask you to come and clean up. And I call that framework, okay, that's our engagement model for domesticating parents, pacifying parents, or marginalizing parents. And especially when we ask people to bring chicken, burritos, and all this other stuff. And teachers do this. And they say, well, we had parental involvement. And I say, wow. Okay. So these things happen. So there's some teaching that has to take place around parent engagement. Teachers hold negative perceptions towards the notion of parental involvement. So if you read the book, you hear stories about how teachers really feel. And they say, could you cut the tape recorder off, Dr. Webster, and I'm going to tell you how I really feel. And I say, I can't cut my tape recorder off. I got to record it, but I promise I won't put your name in school. But they have real stories about how teachers feel about this. Inadequate metrics for determining success of PI. So again, oftentimes when we look at parental involvement, our only metric is 10 people showed up and that's our sign of whether or not it worked. So revisiting the metric and coming up with real indicators of how we can measure parental involvement is important. And then these are just some of the requirements. Under Section 1118, the law requires that we build school capacity. We conduct, with the involvement of parents, an annual evaluation of the content of these programs. That doesn't happen. And as a researcher, Lauren, we know if we want continuous improvement, we got to have evaluation and data to make those improvements happen. We don't evaluate parental programs at the local, state, or national level. We just have monitoring reports that exist. And some research from scholars in the field. Provide training for teachers, principals, and other support staff to deconstruct some of these negative perceptions. Professional development time has to be focused on understanding the value and merit of parental involvement. That doesn't happen, but it's required. Problems with policy implementation. I won't go through the whole list, but these are some of the things that affect implementation. But what we need, I think, is a few things that I want to leave you with. Basically, redefining parental involvement from a parent's perspective and not the school-centric perspective. Review of parental involvement initiatives, like really having rigorous evaluations to inform the field and inform where we are as a community with that work and holding folks accountable for continuous improvement. Interactive professional development for all faculty and staff. I've seen that really change mindsets. Out-of-box technologies for really building infrastructure for that, because we have to text people and email them, and we can't just send flyers home. So technologies have to be updated. Creative solutions for leveraging in-kind contributions of parent volunteerism to attract other private support and investment. And I know Michael could appreciate this as an AmeriCorps forerunner. You know, when we talk about the value of parental involvement and valuing parents' times, it's not just about them showing up at the schoolhouse, but there's a value to that. And when we start to put a value to it, it might make the difference of $1 million in time that makes up the equivalent of 10 more staff people that, quote, the good school had for parental involvement versus the school that did not track and leverage that in kind. But for the funders in the room, it's also an opportunity to challenge schools to raise funds based on counting that in kind and attracting matching dollars to support and fund the initiatives better. And last but not least, just strategic planning and consultation to increase the effectiveness of parental involvement strategies. We need a cadre of consultants. We have a lot of them that make a whole lot of money doing capacity building and consultation of nonprofits. We need a cadre of consultants focused on building capacity for parental involvement in schools. Thank you.